Nebuchadnezzar, the most unlikely convert ever. The epitome, beginning as the epitome of the head of the kingdom of men. And as we saw on Wednesday night, the hero's not Nebuchadnezzar. The hero's not Nebuchadnezzar, as interesting as it is. The hero of this story is God. The power is God's word. That's the bit we get excited about, isn't it? Because God can change people if we allow him to work. Now, I'm going to put the fine print in right at the start, just to set some people's minds at rest, if you feel that. At the end of the day, the good news we have is that it's not up to us to determine who is going to be in the kingdom and who's not going to be in the kingdom. Of course, that is the prerogative of our Lord. So you can form your own opinion. You will see as we go through this that I am of the opinion that the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar was complete. But there's some of you that may sort of still hold reservations, and that's okay. Hopefully you'll see some of the arguments that I put together here, but if not, then you can still see a remarkable change in this man based on the word of God. So to really understand just how transformative this conversion is, we need to have a bit of a feel for just what a remarkable man Nebuchadnezzar was as a man. Now, we know, and the scriptures tell us this, that he was remarkable not just because of his sort of physical attributes that he had, but because God was working with him. God was working with him. But he didn't necessarily know that to begin with. And the story of Nebuchadnezzar really starts with his father, a remarkable man himself. His father's name was Nabopolassar. And again, we've got, particularly in the 2000s, and really from the 1900s onwards, we're just blessed with a whole pile of information that allow us to build up a background to a story that we have here in the scriptures. Babylonian kings and the Assyrian kings and all the others, we think that social media is a modern phenomenon, and I guess it is when it comes to sort of phones and whatnot. But the idea of capturing what you did and recording it for posterity and sending it out is not a new concept, not in the slightest. And these Babylonian kings, they had social media. It's just their difference was they had to stick it onto clay tablets and bits and pieces like that. But these have been discovered. And so we have a lot of information about the history. Now, of course, they have their own little biases, as is the case. But what is absolutely remarkable is, and we expect it to be the case, the correlation between what has been discovered through archaeological digs and the record of the scriptures. And it makes fascinating reading. It's so easy for us to get hold of. You can simply go to Wikipedia and read all about Nabopolassar, for example. And it dovetails in with the scriptural records. And it is supported by the artefacts that have been found from an archaeological perspective. But I'm going to give you sort of the quick version of I've called it the rise of Babylon, because that's really what it was. I mean, Babylon itself was an ancient city-state. It was in the plain of Shinar. You probably see the linkage. It's the idea, the name comes from the root Balal, to confound, believed to be the location of the Tower of Babel. Originally occupied by the descendants of Cush and followers of Nimrod, but then later occupied by various people. And when we get to this period of time, the Assyrians are in control of Babylon. But the Assyrians had an interesting sort of relationship with Babylon. See, Babylon had a cultural element to it that the Assyrians admired, a little bit like the Romans admired the Greek culture. So the Romans, as we know, essentially took over as far as the world empire is concerned from the Greeks, but they retained Greek culture. Well, similarly with the Assyrians. The Assyrians saw Babylon as their sort of cultural centre, even though they were militarily in control of it. And of course, Babylonians weren't particularly keen on having the Assyrians as their overlords. But again, you look at it, and the Assyrians sort of saw it almost like a marriage relationship. The Babylon was the bride, Assyria was the husband. It's interesting, isn't it? Babylon is used as a symbol of a bride, even in the scriptures. Unfortunately, though, of course, it is used as a symbol of a false bride, the harlot system. But that's the sort of the the relationship between Babylon and Assyria. Assyria had control over the whole region when we sort of start our story here, but Babylon had this sort of unique place as a cultural centre. And we really sort of pick up our story in about 626 BC, where Nabopolassar, who is the father of Nebuchadnezzar, seizes the throne of Assyria. So the Assyrian kingdom was starting to decline, although it wasn't necessarily completely evident at this point in time. And so he makes a move. There have been various rebellions all through the period of time, but he started a war which went for about 10 years as he took Babylon successfully, set himself up as the king there, and then took various cities. But then, of course, the Assyrians came down and took back certain cities, and then he took them back. And for about 10 years, there was this sort of toing and froing. But ultimately, Nabopolassar was successful in holding Babylon and the cities of Babylonia. So, after that 10-year period, Nabopolassar, who really only wanted Babylon, decided that he needed to create a buffer zone. He needed to create some form of protecting this sort of Babylonia, this area around Babylon that he was particularly interested in, from the Assyrians, because otherwise they could wander down and continue to put Babylon at risk. So what he did was he then started to invade Assyria. So instead of Assyria, Assyria proper, we might call it, instead of this sort of these interactions, these wars, these skirmishes that are happening at the boundary of Assyria, now all of a sudden Nabopolassar, based on his success that he had in and around Babylonia, starts to come into Assyria for the purpose of creating a buffer zone. But of course, that starts to make Assyria very worried. He's suddenly helped in that by the Medes, which is curious because, of course, we know that later on it was the Medes and the Persians who were aligned against Babylon. But at this point in time, the Medes align with Babylon, not against Babylon. And, interestingly enough, they formalised their allegiance together. So the Medes were keen on the territory of Assyria, like all man's kingdoms are. And Babylon and the Medes formalised their alliance by the marrying of Nebuchadnezzar, here he is, to the daughter of the Median king, whose name is Amytas. So you can see they're both coming in. Now there's the increased strength against the Assyrians. So the Medo-Babylonian army basically continue, because of their initial success, continue in through Assyria. And why am I going all through this, other than the fact that it's interesting? It's to give you some idea of how a very small ambition on the part of Nabopolassar to just get Babylon suddenly starts to spiral, doesn't it? It starts to snowball. It's getting bigger and bigger. He's having more and more success. Sure, he's having the odd setback and the Assyrians are still a force to be reckoned with, but it's gaining momentum. The Medes start joining. All of a sudden, instead of just being able to create a buffer zone for his own protection around Babylon, he's now starting to be a serious contender. And you can see in 612, they brutally sack Nineveh, so the capital of Assyria. And that's like a turning point. This massive capital of the Assyrian Empire is destroyed by this combined Babylonian Mede army. And then they continue through following years to take progressively more and more of Assyria. Interestingly, you can see there a little bit, I sort of skipped over it before, but interestingly at this time, the Egyptians were aligned with the Assyrians. Oh, what's that, I hear you say? That seems strange. Well, the Egyptians were aligned with the Assyrians because they saw the Assyrians as this buffer for themselves against these sort of rampaging type people like the Medes in particular that were causing grief. But you get to 608, and here's an interesting thing. Again, it's where it dovetails in with the scriptures. Pharaoh Necho, we've heard of him, haven't we? Pharaoh Necho II, he led an Egyptian army into Assyria to try and rescue what remained of Assyria, but in reality it was a lost cause. By that stage they were gone. And it was during his move from Egypt up through Israel that, of course, we know Josiah went out against him. And we even know, again, from the biblical record that Pharaoh Necho goes, I haven't got a problem with you. Why are you coming against me? And we know that Josiah died in that battle. And the reason that Pharaoh Necho didn't have anything against Josiah at that point in time is because he was making his way up to the region of Assyria to try and stop this incredible success that Nabopolassar was having along with the Medes. They did have some success. So, what happened is that the Babylonians and the Medes, they were successful in Assyria, but then they had to keep going back to ensure that they kept their own sort of area safe. So Pharaoh Necho actually established himself up. He was there for a few years, and he ended up essentially taking the whole region of Israel for himself. But then in 605, as always happens, along came back the avenging Medes and Babylonians. And Pharaoh Necho was defeated devastatingly. In fact, again, if you can believe their clay social media posts, there wasn't a single soldier that survived that attack. And so his army's annihilated. And interestingly enough, the commander of that particular battle in 605 was Nebuchadnezzar. So Nabopolassar, starting to get, a bit tired and sore knees probably, all the rest of the stuff that happens when you get old, had sent his son, Nebuchadnezzar, to lead up that. And Nebuchadnezzar was outstandingly successful in destroying the Egyptians at that point in time. So the Egyptians still exist as a country down there, but they've lost their army that was based up in the old region of Assyria. And now there's this undisputed rulership of the area that the Assyrians had, including the area of Israel. But of course, we see that again, don't we, in the scriptures? Because, we see the vacillation of Israel or Judah, between Egypt and then Babylon. They're putting their trust in Egypt. And Jeremiah is saying, no, you can't, that's not going to save you. The Babylonians are going to be coming. But they could see by the things around them, they looked more like Egypt was going to be there, because that's exactly what was happening at this point in time. Anyway, in 605, Nabopolassar dies, and Nebuchadnezzar ends up going back to establish and consolidate his role as the king. And then, of course, we get into some areas that we know quite well. Nebuchadnezzar, because of the rebellion of Israel, and obviously because it's fulfilling the Bible prophecy, he led a force into Israel and he took captives, including Daniel, at this time. That was 604. Then 598, there's another two. So he went in after Jehoiakim's rebellion. And then, of course, we know Jehoiachin reigned for just 3 months, and he was taken off to Babylon as well, along with captives. And then ultimately in 586, Nebuchadnezzar invades Judah a fourth time, and Jerusalem is destroyed. Then from about 585 to 572, Nebuchadnezzar destroys other countries that were around that. Edom, Moab, Tyre, Sidon, Ammon. Interestingly, I'm not sure if we'll turn it up later or not, but all of that was prophesied in Jeremiah 27. God prophesied that this would be the case. And that's exactly what happened. And you can sort of read the history and find it's just staggering how he fulfilled it. He then destroyed Egypt. Because of Egypt's interference, the fact that they were inciting people to rebel against Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar came down into Egypt and cleaned them up. And of course, that also was prophesied in the scriptures, because when the Jews, after Gedaliah was killed, so after Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem, we know the story there, and Gedaliah was killed, and then they said to Jeremiah, well, tell us and we'll do whatever you say. And Jeremiah said, stay here. So they said, we're not doing that, we're going to Egypt. So ever way, isn't it, with the flesh? And those people, as Jeremiah prophesied, ended up being caught again and destroyed by Babylon. So you can see how, that the record is just remarkable. And then in 562, Nebuchadnezzar died aged in his 80s. Who cares? Who cares? Well, the reason that's relevant is because this man thought He was unique and special. And in some ways he was. In some ways he was. They had a meteoric rise to power and fame. Both his father and then the consolidation and the effectiveness that Nebuchadnezzar put in place. It was meteoric. It transformed the world. It destroyed the most powerful nation that existed in Assyria. That wasn't even their intent. Their intent was simply to try and begin with holding a city of Babylon. And then it just rolled on from there. And it's like everything they touched now, notwithstanding the fact that, there's in any war some toies and froies, but pretty much everything they touched worked in their favour. They ended up as rulers over the world. Literally the head of the kingdom of men. If we had a little map, and again, there's a lot of detail. It's probably pretty hard for you to read that, but there's a lot of detail there. There's sort of coloured, the shaded sections where the region, and they're different colours, but largely the region that Assyria had control over to begin with. And this little map's probably the easiest one. You ended up, by the end of the process, Babylon had this great chunk, the Medes had the northern section, and Egypt were back in their little den. That was it. That's what surrounded the nation of Israel. Meteoric rise, huge power in such a short period of time. In a period of 20 years, gone from nothing to ruling the world. There's lots written about Nebuchadnezzar. Here's a commentary by Rawlinson. It's quoted in Easton's Bible Dictionary, which is where I grabbed it from. It says, modern research has shown that Nebuchadnezzar was, now, this is just someone's opinion, I guess, but it's someone who's done a fair bit of study on this man, that Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest monarch that Babylon, or perhaps the East generally, ever produced. He must have possessed an enormous command of human labour. He goes on to describe how so much of the bricks and the ruins have his name stamped on them. He appears to have built or restored almost every city and temple in the whole country. His inscriptions give an elaborate account of the immense works which he constructed in and about Babylon itself, abundantly illustrating the boast, we just read up before, is not this great Babylon which I have built. So in Daniel chapter 4, when Nebuchadnezzar says those words, it's not just an idle boast, is it? It's not just an idle boast. It's not like us saying it. Maybe we've mowed the lawn or something and we feel a sense of pride. He's not talking about that. He's built the whole lot. Everywhere he looks out, he's built. The bricks are inscribed with his name. There's a lot of work that's been done that follows the archaeological findings to try and reconstruct just what Babylon was like. And, it's amazing. And it's so easy to find. It's available. In fact, many of you will have gone to various museums and areas where bits have either been replicated, taken from the sites, or rebuilt. The population of ancient Babylon during this period of time was estimated to be about 500,000 people, which is a staggeringly large city for those times. The walls, as many of you will know, were considered impregnable. And we know the story that was necessary for the Medes and the Persians to later take it over. They were approximately 18 kilometres long, just under 30 metres wide. And Nebuchadnezzar built a whole lot of infrastructure as well. He built canals, aqueducts, reservoirs. He set the city up. He wasn't just a military man. I mean, some people are good at fighting battles and strategists and all of that kind of stuff. But he was, in a sense, he was everything, wasn't he? He could fight battles. He could lead these great armies against the might of the Egyptians and win. But he could also do engineering works. He could see the importance of infrastructure. He could put up governance. Now here's those famous Ishtar Gate. Incredible. There's the Hanging Gardens, believed to have been, well, they were one of the ancient wonders of the world. And it's not just that either, and we're going to see, you'll see in just a little minute, how the scriptures pick up these things as well. It's remarkable. But they have found that mathematics was another area where the Babylonians excelled. So I don't know how well you can see that, but you can sort of see, squares and circles and triangles and stuff. So if there's any, people just started school and they know all about geometry and things, sines and cosines, well, that's where they were. So they have found texts where they could see geometry, algebra. In fact, this is an interesting thing, the Babylonian numerical system was sexagesimal, which is base 60, which is why there's 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. That's a base 60 system of capturing things. But they've also found that Babylonians had symbols for 10 and 100 and 1,000, so they seem to have had a part decimal system as well. They knew about square roots and completing the square and the value of pi, which of course is the ratio of circumference to diameter of a circle. So there's all these things. It's like the perfect man, isn't it? He can fight battles, he can lead people. But he's really good at engineering and building and infrastructure and governance. And he happens to be pretty good at maths and science. And can you sort of see just where he is from a human perspective? Now, if we jump sort of to the end, we looked before at the rise of Babylon. Well, this, if you like, is the decline and the end. As we said, Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 43 years and he died in his sort of early 80s. He was succeeded by his son in BC 562, who only reigned for 2 years, and then he's murdered. So all of a sudden, the stability and the future-lookingness and the statesmanship and the wisdom turns into turmoil, doesn't it? This rise of Babylon that went from nothing to the world power suddenly goes from being the world power to nothing again. So Nebuchadnezzar's son's murdered by his brother-in-law. He reigns in his place. Then he's murdered. Son reigns for a few months. And then ultimately Nabonidus rules in conjunction with his son Belshazzar. And we know him, don't we? Belshazzar, the eldest son of Nabonidus, co-regent. Nabonidus went on to an expedition. Interestingly, as it says there, that Belshazzar was related to Nebuchadnezzar. His mother, Belshazzar's mother, was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. And we know the story, don't we? We know what happens. It's recorded in the scriptures. Less than a quarter of a century. You look at the times, there was basically a quarter of a century where Babylon went through Nabopolassar primarily, but by Nebuchadnezzar as well, went from nothing to the ruling the world, and then there was a quarter of a century where it went from ruling the world to nothing. Babylon fell under Cyrus when their former allies, the Medes, turned against them in BC 539. Incredible story, isn't it? Incredible story. It's like a flash, where this remarkable man and let's have a look at what Unger says. Most of us have got one of those on our shelves. Go and have a look at that. This is his summary of Nebuchadnezzar. The worldwide glory of Babylon owed more to Nebuchadnezzar than to any other man. A man of great force and decision of character, not severe in his dealings beyond the custom of his age. I mean, we might think he's fairly severe, poking eyes out and whatnot, but according to the custom of the age, a man who could plan and execute great and daring movements, he may surely be regarded as one of antiquity's greatest men. Now, Unger says that, and he's just looking at what Nebuchadnezzar did. He's not looking at what God did to Nebuchadnezzar. And that's the exciting bit. Because Nebuchadnezzar goes through 3 distinct phases. He starts off as Nebuchadnezzar the Conqueror. He's absolutely confident, proud, arrogant. He can do anything. He can destroy the Assyrians. But then God comes into his life and he gets a bit confused. Conflicting emotions. He starts to doubt his own strength. He worships Daniel for revealing the dream and the interpretation in Daniel chapter 2. But then in Daniel chapter 3, he rebels, doesn't he? He constructs a golden image, all of gold. My head's not going to go, I'm forever. So you see this sort of confusion and the conflicting emotions that he has. He thinks he can overcome God through his own cunning, but yet he acknowledges the God of heaven has power. He's full of fury at the faithful stand of the three friends, yet he acknowledges the power when they're saved. And then he gets to what I believe is Nebuchadnezzar the converted. And this is his pinnacle. This is the pinnacle. It's not him fighting the battles, not him building the aqueducts, strengthening the walls, the hanging gardens. It's not how good he was at maths and science, but when he's humbled. And Daniel chapter 4 is the story of his ultimate humbling, isn't it? But I want to just take us through and look in a bit more detail at each of these phases. And we'll look at some of the quotes, but just because we've got a bit to go through, we might just look at where I know all of us, I think it's fair to say, are reasonably familiar with the record. So just allow the story, if you like, in these various phases of Nebuchadnezzar's life to wash over you and understand how God was working with this man. And this is how he starts off. This is how he's introduced to us, isn't it, so far as the scriptures are concerned? Just flick back a few pages to Daniel chapter 1. He is completely opposed to God. He's promoting the gods of Babylon. He's promoting the learning and the culture of the Chaldees. It's interesting though, isn't it? You get a slight insight to, as I've said there on the screen, he wasn't xenophobic. You know, some rulers were, weren't they? Some rulers, you go into a place and they'd massacre the lot. You know, they didn't want any foreigners coming in to upset the status that was there. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't like that. And that actually shows his confidence. You know, Nebuchadnezzar was looking for the best. We know that's the case because he picked Daniel and those who were the brightest and the best from the places where they had actually been successful in campaigning. So instead of subjugating them, he adopted them, albeit they were adopted into Babylonish ways. So they weren't allowed to keep their indigenous beliefs and culture. They had to adopt Babylonish ways. But he wanted to take them there. So you sort of start getting a bit of this is a confident man, isn't it? It's a confident person who can stand up and say, yeah, I'm not worried that, you know, we're going to be undermined by taking on these smart, clever people from the places that we subdue. I'm going to take them and turn them into my people. Another thing we see early on in Daniel is that he was not very tolerant, was he? He expected immediate and unquestioning obedience to the smallest of his wishes. And if you didn't, you were dead. They didn't sort of muck around. We know that verse 10 there is, the prince of the eunuchs says, if you are eating something other than what the king said and you look slightly ill, I'm in for the chop. Now, this is an interesting one. This gives you some idea. As I said before, he was an incredibly clever person. He was look at verse 20. I don't know if you've ever sort of thought this before. So we know the story, Daniel 1. You know, Daniel and his three friends and the other bright sparks are brought into effectively the Babylonish university and they're trained up, they're taught the way. And they're fed good stuff, with the idea being that at the end of it, they can contribute to the Babylonish kingdom. But have a look at verse 20. Well, actually, verse 19. Well, verse 18. The end of the days, the king brings them in. So here they go before Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19, and the king communed with them. So the king's talking with them. And among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. Now listen to this. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. Now we might read it and say, well, that's good. You know, you can only make that determination if you are of a similar intellectual capability. Otherwise, you know, if you're not, everyone looks smart, don't they? Particularly in those times, because, of course, you would be foolish if you didn't try and make yourself look smart if you're one of the wise men. But Nebuchadnezzar could commune with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and he could tell that what they were saying was right, that they were more intelligent, that they were more discerning, that they weren't. Now, we know that that's also because God was helping them in that process. But Nebuchadnezzar had the ability to discern, to interrogate, and to determine which were the cleverest of the graduates. And I think that's an insight into his capability as well. I mean, you know, he was able to see through the deceit of the wise men, but he did have a terrible temper. It's his selfishness, can't you? He's consumed with himself. He's the man, and he knows it. When his temper was aroused, he would act very rashly. So that's how he starts out. It's sort of how we can see a lot of people in the world starting out, isn't it? Full of themselves, confident in their own strength, dismissive of other people. That's how he started. But then God now intervenes and he moves into this, what I've called this confused phase. And this is interesting, isn't it? You know, he rewards Daniel chapter 2. Again, we know the words so well towards the end of it. He's very quick to reward Daniel. He's genuine in his admiration for Daniel and his God. You can't read the end of Daniel chapter 2 without seeing that there's a genuine admiration for it. He's like, wow, that's amazing. He acknowledges Daniel. He acknowledges Daniel's God. He's not going to submit to them. He's not going to do what they said, but he acknowledges it. He's even prepared to take advice from Daniel. See that in verse 49 of Daniel chapter 2. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. I mean, dictatorial tyrants aren't usually that enthusiastic about receiving advice from other people. But Nebuchadnezzar's open to it. And then we know in chapter 3, this switch, isn't it? This confusedness, because he goes to enormous effort and cost to prove God wrong. And again, we know the story. He makes the image all of gold. There it is. It's direct defiance of the vision, the dream that it had. It's not just a head. It's the whole image. And it's on a plain. There's no mountain that the stone can be cut out of without hands. And there he is defying God. It's not going to be the case. And then he does this. You know, he makes the ambush, doesn't he? Isn't Daniel chapter 3 the ultimate ambush? All the leaders there, a plain. When the music sounds, everyone that's not going to comply is going to stand out. Now, it's clever. It's very clever. Very clever. It allowed no room for anyone to be other than aligned with what Nebuchadnezzar said. And like, again, from a purely sort of political ambush perspective, it's a fantastic idea. Peer pressure. Daniel 3, peer pressure. You will never get more peer pressure than Daniel chapter 3, will you? Everyone who's anyone in the whole of the kingdom bowing down. A testament to the enormous faith of Daniel's three friends. And of course, and again, this is a little bit of supposition, but I think solid supposition, because Daniel doesn't appear in Daniel chapter 3. What would Daniel have done, the man Daniel? In Daniel chapter 3, we know what he would have done. He would not have bowed down. He didn't bow down. He didn't stop praying. Later on, of course, in the incident of the lions, So there is no doubt that Daniel would have refused to have bowed down. So I believe that Nebuchadnezzar is clever. See, people that are just headstrong but not clever aren't necessarily going to think through what someone like Nebuchadnezzar could think through. And here he is. He's clever enough to ensure that somehow Daniel's not there. The fact there's no mention means Daniel's not there. So he's clever enough to realise that he's going to have to pull this off and he's going to ambush all the leaders, but he makes sure there's not going to be a scene. Daniel's gone. Where he was, we don't know. And I think that goes some way to explaining just how furious he was with the three friends. He'd come up with the best plan. Okay, he knew he wasn't going to be able to get Daniel, but he knew he could force, through peer pressure, every other leader. And he'd forgotten about Daniel's three friends. And so, he cleverly, we know, provided this second opportunity to them. Well, maybe you're not ready, But again, his confused state comes out because he foolishly made the response of the three friends a contest between him and Yahweh, didn't he? That's the problem. End of verse 15 of Daniel chapter 3. Who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Because that's what Daniel 3 is all about. And he couldn't stop himself from revealing the root cause of this whole incident. And of course, as soon as he said that, and there's no indication, of course, that Daniel's three friends were in any way wavering whatsoever. But it's almost like as soon as he said that, you can imagine how that would have stiffened their resolve, can't you, brothers and sisters and young people? If they had been feeling a bit sort of pressured and wavering and things, when those words came out of Nebuchadnezzar's mouth, the issue's clear and they make the point. It's no longer our contest. You just put yourself up against God. It's a bit like David with Goliath, isn't it? As soon as David heard Goliath's challenge to God, it's a foregone conclusion. He's just a bit player now because this is not about David and Goliath, it's about God and Goliath. This isn't about the three friends and Nebuchadnezzar. This is God and Nebuchadnezzar. And so you can see this sort of foolish response in it because Nebuchadnezzar's fighting. He's fighting against. He's so used to having it his own way, he can't handle someone else being the top dog, in this case, God. And you see his uncontrollable anger. If ever you need it, and I love the King James Version is the epitome of understatement, isn't it? Then was Nebuchadnezzar, verse 19, full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was angry beyond description. And his commands become illogical, don't they? 7 times hotter. Who needs it 7 times hotter? That heat would have been enough to do the job. It ended up killing off probably his best of the bodyguard. But he's consumed with rage because here is the battle. Here is the battle, brothers and sisters, young people. Here is the battle. It's the same battle we experience, isn't it? It's the natural man being challenged by God. And he doesn't like it. We don't like it, naturally speaking. Pride is at stake. Our position, what we've achieved is at stake. And it's all epitomised in this man. And he's full of fury. But when the angel comes and saves him, he's prepared to accept the evidence and admit his mistakes. That is why God can work in people's lives. That's it. It's the same with us. God can work if we can acknowledge we're wrong. There might be times when we're rebelling. There might be times when we're fighting against. But unless we can acknowledge that God is right and that we were wrong, God cannot work. That's the difference between a heart that turns and a stiff neck isn't it? A stiff neck can't acknowledge it. It cannot acknowledge it. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter whether it's in your face, it will not acknowledge it. And God can't do anything with that. It's what Naaman went through too, wasn't it? Naaman did the same thing. I'm not going to that. I know Abana and Pharpar far better than this filthy river Jordan. I'm not going to do that. Rebelling. And his servants speak to him and he listens, acknowledges he's wrong. He goes and does what God says. And we know the end of the story. It's the same. It's the same. God can work but only if we can admit our mistakes. Here's an interesting thing, again, slightly obscure one, I guess, but I find this interesting. And it's an insight into Nebuchadnezzar himself. So you don't need to turn this up, I'm going to tell you what it is. Nebuchadnezzar, as it turned out, incorrectly, assumed that the kings of Judah would feel an obligation to their God. 2 Chronicles 36 verse 13, he actually made the king swear by God. And from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, you can sort of see him say, well, now he's going to do it. I've made him swear by his God. That's a pretty rock solid way, but it wasn't, as it turned out. And you can almost feel this, there's a despite his arrogance and his self-aggrandizement in his eyes and all of those sort of things, there's a way that Nebuchadnezzar has a simple kind of understanding, isn't it? When God is doing something, he's prepared to acknowledge. And it's almost like he's staggered that the kings of Judah wouldn't do something when he's made them swear by their very own God. And of course, we know that he ruthlessly dealt with the kings of Judah. But now, let's turn this one up. This is Jeremiah 39. Now, again, I don't know whether you've just noticed the specificness of this particular account. So this is the end. Zedekiah is about to be destroyed. And we pick it up, you see in verse 8, verse 5, rather. Chaldean's army pursued after them, overtook Zedekiah on the plains of Jericho, and then they bring him up to Nebuchadnezzar. So here he is. Zedekiah's brought up to Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar's going to give judgment to him. Verse 6, he slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Also the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar himself, didn't get someone else, he slew the nobles of Judah. Moreover, he put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him with chains to carry him to Babylon. But have a look at verse 11. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, gave charge concerning Jeremiah to Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, saying, take him and look well to him and do him no harm, but do unto him even as he shall say unto thee. Isn't that remarkable? Nebuchadnezzar the king said that. Now, if that was just being driven by, Jeremiah's been pretty good and he's been, prophesying that we were going to come and he's been telling the Jews to submit to us, Babylon. If that sort of message came down, then maybe you would have that happening at a lower level, isn't it? The captain of the army or someone lower down is going to say, hey, that guy was pretty good. He's, let's look after him. But this is coming from the king himself. That's how involved he is. Directly, personally, individually. And I think, again, somewhat supposition, but reasonably likely, that message was less about Jeremiah's support for Babylon and his calls for the Jews to submit to Babylon, and more because of a relationship that he had, Nebuchadnezzar, with Daniel. And Daniel telling Nebuchadnezzar personally and individually about the role of Jeremiah and the importance of being looked after. And then Nebuchadnezzar himself with all the busy, none of us, I assume, have, led an army into battle. But it's not hard to imagine it's a pretty busy time. There's lots of things happening. There's lots of things on your mind. And yet in the middle of all of that, this man, this confused man at this point in time, takes the effort to make sure that insignificant prophet who's in a dungeon and is filthy clothes, rags and scrawny and dying of hunger, the king of the world, makes sure that he's looked after. Incredible thing. Now, again, we know that God is superintending all of these things and will make it happen. But ultimately, people have to conform, don't they? Otherwise, God has to get someone else to do it. But this man was quite remarkable. And this, we're in Jeremiah. Just flick back to chapter 27. This is quite remarkable. He's chosen and called by God as his servant. Look at verse 5. Oh, actually, verse 3 while we're there. Remember I mentioned before, send them to the king of Edom, king of Moab, Ammonites, Tyre, Sidon. Right, this is a message to them as well as to Israel, because that's what happened. That's what's going to be the case. Nebuchadnezzar is going to do that. What? I've made the earth, says God, the man and the beast that are upon the ground by my great power, by my outstretched arm. I have given it unto whom it seemed unto me. I'm the one that decided it. And now have I given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. All nations, verse 7, shall serve him, and his son, and his son's son, until I'm done with them. And as we said, 25 years after the end of Nebuchadnezzar. And then we get to the last bit. So you got Nebuchadnezzar the Conqueror, he had to be smashed down. The confused as God's working there, and then ultimately the converted. And come back to Daniel chapter 4. To me this is remarkable. Not many people were given the privilege of writing a chapter of the Bible, are they? The Word of God, sharp, powerful, changes people. And here is a man, a Gentile king, who gets to write a chapter of the Bible in the first person. Why isn't it a narrative? Could have been, couldn't it? Just a narrative. That's how most of the scriptures are. That's how the rest of Daniel is. Except for a few bits where Daniel writes in the first person. Interesting, isn't it? I think the reason is because Daniel chapter 4 is a voluntary account. A narrative's not voluntary, is it? Narrative, someone says, and this happened on such and such a day. And the people, the players, if you like, they don't have any choice. They're just getting written about. But this is voluntary. Verse 2. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought for me. This is Nebuchadnezzar's desire. This is Nebuchadnezzar voluntarily putting down the events, which at the end of the day are events of some embarrassment, aren't they? They're going to talk about him essentially going through some psychotic episode and thinking he's an animal and losing everything that he had based on his pride. Who's going to sort of share that voluntarily? Sort of thing you try and hush up, isn't it? Put in, nothing really happened here. He doesn't. He voluntarily wants to share his experience. It's remarkable. And you look at his opening summary, and it is exactly the point of the dream of the image. Now, we know that took a fair bit of getting for Nebuchadnezzar to get that. Daniel 3, he's fighting against it. But you have a look at Daniel 4, verse 3. How great are his signs, this is Nebuchadnezzar speaking in the first person. How mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. What was the point of Nebuchadnezzar's image, really, in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44? The days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Nebuchadnezzar says, actually, he's right. His kingdom's the everlasting kingdom. That's the conclusion Nebuchadnezzar's come to after the experiences of Daniel chapter 4. Exactly what God wanted people to come to in Daniel chapter 2. You even see before the events of Daniel chapter 4, and Nebuchadnezzar starts out by describing the pre-incident activities. You can even see that he started to change, isn't it? As he went through that confused cycle, it started to change. His attitude to the dream and the interpretation is quite different from chapter 2. Chapter 2, he's impatient, he's rash, he's full of anger and frustration and suspicion. Daniel chapter 4, he's a bit calmer. He shares the dream. He's not upset by the inability to interpret it. But he does know he's got Daniel, doesn't he? And that's such a good thing. They all come before him. You can imagine him sitting there saying, yep. But at the last, verse 8, Daniel came in before me. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because see how Nebuchadnezzar uses Daniel's Hebrew name. See, this is his first person recount. This is him writing it himself. This is, as it were, his diary entry, isn't it? And what's the word he uses to describe this man who he had called back when he first came there? Belteshazzar. Now, he still has to use Belteshazzar, of course, because presumably some of the people reading it would only know Daniel by his Chaldee name. But this is the name Nebuchadnezzar gives him, Daniel. Interesting, isn't it? The last Daniel came in before me. Whose name is Belteshazzar, just to clarify for those that aren't familiar with Daniel. And you see his unshakable faith at this time in Daniel's ability to reveal the interpretation. Now, he's still a bit confused. He's still on the journey, isn't he? He's still stalking the multiplicity of gods, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. That disappears later on. But in this first phase, he's not quite there yet. But what he is he's convinced in Daniel's linkage to truth. He knows Daniel can tell him. He knows that his other wise men can't, but Daniel can. And I think that, now it starts getting, even more compelling, I think. Look at Daniel's response. If we weren't sure whether Nebuchadnezzar was on this journey, in my mind, Daniel's response gives it away. Daniel had a high opinion of Nebuchadnezzar. He had a high opinion. Verse 19, when Daniel hears the dream, and of course he's able to interpret it through God's power, he knows the interpretation is right, for 1 hour, he can't bring himself to tell Nebuchadnezzar the meaning of the dream. His thoughts trouble him. That's the sign of a friend, isn't it? You've heard some news, you know that it's going to upset someone that you respect, someone that you, dare I say it, someone that you love. And for an hour, Daniel, he knows the dream's interpretation straight away, but for an hour he's avoiding telling Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, in the end, Nebuchadnezzar has to say, just tell me, Daniel. King spake and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. Just tell me as it is. And look at his response. My Lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation of thy enemies. So can you see that relationship there? Now, you might say, well, perhaps Daniel was like that to everyone. Perhaps Daniel was naturally submissive. I mean, at the end of the day, he was a captive. Go to chapter 5. No hesitation by Daniel there, is it? We know the story. Belshazzar this time comes. He takes Belshazzar, the complete antithesis of Nebuchadnezzar, full of himself, impossible to change, would not listen to God. And when, of course, the handwriting goes on the wall, look at Daniel's response. He didn't wait an hour, did he? He didn't hold himself back. Quite the opposite. If you go to verse 17, then Daniel answered straight away and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, give thy rewards to another. I'm not interested in what you can give me, says Daniel to Belshazzar. Not interested at all, but I'm going to tell you what it means. You, king, Forget the fact, verse 18, that the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar our father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honour, and he gave him all people, nations and languages, and they all trembled before him. See, immediately Daniel's going back to Nebuchadnezzar, isn't it? But when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed. They took it. He's driven away, verse 21. See, Daniel's going through this whole event that happened with Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar. And the difference is, at the end of verse 21, Nebuchadnezzar knew in the end that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men and appointed over it whomsoever he will. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. You've lifted up yourself, and therefore you're going to be destroyed. See the difference between the two? So Daniel had a high opinion of Nebuchadnezzar. Interestingly enough, Daniel actually gives the king advice. I don't know if you noticed that in verse 27. So he gives the interpretation, and then he gives the king advice. Now remember, this is the king of the world. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee. Break off thy sins by righteousness and thy iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. Now, can you imagine someone giving the king, I hope this isn't being recorded too many places, but you imagine someone giving that advice to Trump, for example. You're a servant that's there. Or, unless I'll just pick on him, or any ruler of mankind, any CEO. What are they'd say? Who do you think you are? I'm the king. Daniel felt confident, giving behavioural advice to the king. You can't do that if you expect the king to suddenly lash out. And you know what? I think this is even more amazing. Nebuchadnezzar took the advice. See, we read verse 29 and we skip over the first bit, don't we? We look at verse 28. All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar at the end of 12 months. He walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon? And we miss the point that for 12 months, Nebuchadnezzar did what Daniel suggested. A year. How many of us aren't committing the same sins in the very week that we've just sought forgiveness for? And Nebuchadnezzar, for 12 months, had those words of Daniel going through his mind. You look at the end of Daniel chapter 4, and you can see that Nebuchadnezzar's response to that activity that he went through is exactly what God wanted from him. Yeah, it's the amazing thing. We won't, just from a timing point of view, we won't look up that piece, but in your own time, have a look at the prayer of Solomon. He talks about not even Jews. Like if a stranger comes and seeks God, then here in heaven, and that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar did. His conclusion, his desire to have a relationship with God is so clear. You know, Nebuchadnezzar understood and acknowledged the lesson that God wanted him to learn. And perhaps most remarkably of all, and as our sort of example, something for us to remember, to take away, he's thankful. Thankful to God for showing it to him. Verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, the same Nebuchadnezzar that God had taken from his throne, that he'd made him look ridiculous. He'd ended up being like an animal, abased before everyone. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honour the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. What an incredible turnaround. Now, we'll bring our thoughts to a close, but I just want to give you another couple of things that, in my mind, really emphasise why I think this conversion was genuine. You know, this is a classic. Nebuchadnezzar versus Pharaoh. In a way, they're similar, aren't they? Both of them, the rulers, the all-powerful rulers, at a time when Israel was under their control. Let's just have a look at how the scriptures compares the two. We know then from chapter 4 of Daniel that God's aim in working with Nebuchadnezzar was clear. This is what it was. That thou, i.e. Nebuchadnezzar, know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men and giveth it to himself every will. That's why God did it. God did it so that Nebuchadnezzar would know. Primarily to teach Nebuchadnezzar. God wasn't trying to teach Pharaoh anything. He worked with Pharaoh because he wanted to show his power in Pharaoh and that God's name would be declared throughout all the earth. It was for everyone else to see. They're not the same. Nebuchadnezzar and Pharaoh are opposite ends, aren't they? Nebuchadnezzar God was reaching out to Nebuchadnezzar individually. God's just using Pharaoh for his purpose, and that's seen in the next one. Nebuchadnezzar described as God's servant. Look at all the times he's described. We looked at one of those there. Pharaoh is described as a vessel unto dishonour. Did God use him? Absolutely. Was he useful? He was indeed. Did God achieve his purpose through him? Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, he was just a vessel that God was going to break, destroy, once it had fulfilled his purpose. And why? Why? What's the difference? Because Nebuchadnezzar saw signs and wonders as proof of God's existence. When God worked with him, he could acknowledge it. He acknowledged it in Daniel chapter 2. He acknowledged it in Daniel chapter 3. He acknowledged it in Daniel chapter 4. Every single instance where God worked with him, he acknowledged God's work. But Pharaoh did the opposite, didn't he? When the signs and wonders came, he hardened his heart. Well, he sort of relented when the circumstances were awkward and it's really hard when all the rivers are full of blood or there's lots of flies. So he sort of twisted, turned, weaved. But he was the opposite. The opposite. Nebuchadnezzar saw through the deceit of his wise men. Pharaoh encouraged the deceit of his wise men. They're opposite ends, aren't they, of the spectrum. Nebuchadnezzar was prepared to accept the evidence of his eyes and respond accordingly. Pharaoh refused. In the end of Nebuchadnezzar, I was established, as he says in verse 36, in my kingdom, excellent majesty was added unto me. The end of Pharaoh, dead on the seashore. In sort of conclusion, was his conversion genuine? Well, as we've seen, the only Gentile to be given the privilege of writing a chapter of the Bible in the first person. God invested significant time in Nebuchadnezzar. He had two visions, Daniel 2, Daniel 4. God even made him an animal so that he could learn that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. He's repeatedly described as God's servant. Now, you can't put much on this, but it's interesting. You look at how many times he appears in the Bible. 91 times his name appears in the Bible. Interesting, isn't it? I did a little quiz. I bet most people wouldn't have picked the difference. So Daniel's name appears 83 times, Elijah's 69. As I said, you don't have to write that in as some sort of great expositional point, but it just goes to show how much God was working with him. His name is right throughout the scripture. Judah were told to pray for the peace of Babylon. This was not said of any other land of captivity. And we know that the scriptures are clear. Jeremiah 50, 51 are talking about the destruction of Babylon, which happened. God executed justice against them. But that was primarily based on the work, the arrogancy and the desecration of Belshazzar. Daniel had a strong relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. He was genuinely upset at the prospect of his downfall. Felt close enough to offer him advice. And he had his advice followed. And here's an interesting one, isn't it? When Daniel received the vision of the beasts in Daniel chapter 7, we know the story there. different animals, representative of the kingdom of men, another interpretation, God's perspective, if you like, of the kingdom of men. It's interesting, isn't it, that the lion, the Nebuchadnezzar, is portrayed as having the heart of a man. The heart of a man. It replaced the lion's heart, and we've seen, haven't we, that that's what happened. And I am way over time. Sorry about that. I was going to go to Isaiah 57. We know Isaiah 57. What a fantastic piece that is. God will dwell with those who have the right attitude. And in fact, let me just do that really, really quickly because it is so good. Isaiah 57, verse 15. Thus saith the high and lofty one that inhabiteth Assyria. That's the declaration that Nebuchadnezzar made, wasn't it? Whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place with him that is of a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble, to revive the heart of the contrite ones. And we might say, well, what happens if I'm not that way? What happens if I'm not that way? Well, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't that way. And God is not expecting us to be that way to begin with, is he? Because he goes on in verse 16, I will not contend forever, neither will I be always wroth, for the spirit shall fail before me and the sons' souls which I have made. And then God goes to describe the process that Nebuchadnezzar went through. For the iniquity of his covetousness was I wroth. I smote him. I hid me. I was wroth. He went on frowardly in the way of his heart. But I've seen his ways. Will heal him. I will lead him and restore comforts unto him and to his mourners. I create the fruit of the lips. Peace, peace to him that is far off. Can't get much further than Nebuchadnezzar. To him that is nigh. I will heal him. And it's a remarkable thing, and I'm not going to go through this slide, but just showing how Nebuchadnezzar, over his life, over the record we have in Daniel, came to truly understand the God of Daniel. An amazing man, an even more amazing conversion. And of course, all this points to the hero of the story, isn't it? God himself and his powerful word